Shangyin, the Sui Palace. He mounted his carriage and travelled south, took no special precautions, ignoring boxes of memorials that urged him not to go. In the spring wind, the whole kingdom made brocades for the palace. Half he used for mud flaps, half for sails. Okay, we continue with Li Shangjin's heptasyllabic quatrains. This is number 4 out of 7. And this one is more in line, perhaps, with the Secretary Ling Hu poem, in that it contains, and all the following ones that we will be reading in the next stage, Jasper Lake, Chang'e, Master Jia, they all contain cultural and historical references which need to be explained to appreciate the poem. So we will start with that. So this poem is called The Sui Palace. You might remember, because I think we've mentioned it a couple of times, that the Sui dynasty was a very short dynasty that came right before the Tang. It lasted from, I'm talking from memory, from the 580s to the 610s, 620s. So pretty short-lived dynasty, like 40 years or so, but a very important one because under the Sui, China was unified again after 300 years of division. Many people tend to see the Sui dynasty as parallel to the Qin dynasty. Because both were short-lived dynasties, the Qin created the imperial system for the first time, and the Sui restored it after a 300-year hiatus, at least in the national unification of the empire. But both were short-lived and were succeeded by long-lived dynasties that continued them, that polished and eliminated the worst abuses and excesses of their respective predecessor dynasties, but which really continued and reaped the grain. They took the profit from the effort that the brief-lived dynasties that anteceded them had created. So the Qin dynasty unified the whole empire, but it was a system that was too rigid, too authoritarian, and too dependent on the abilities of the individual emperor at the top. And it was succeeded by the Han dynasty, which lasted with a short interregnum for about 400 years, and which really created classical Chinese culture and the imperial system, and it created a model of how the empire could and should be run. The same thing happened with the Tang after as I said, the Tang and the Shui, after the 300 years of division of China at the fall of the Han dynasty, and the founder of the Shui dynasty, at that time still acting as a general for the Northern Zhou dynasty, he unified the country. This was Shui Wendi. He created a new glorious capital in the northwest, which he called Daxingcheng, which would, with just a slight change of name, continue in the following dynasty as Chang'an. And so this emperor Shui Wendi did a good labor at unifying the country. Now, one problem with dynasties, it happened to the Qin, it happened to the Shui, is that they tend to fall into hybris. Because of the success in a great deed, like unifying the whole empire, some of these rulers tend to underestimate the limits to what imperial power can achieve. And so they overexert the machine, and this leads to, the breakdown, and that's an opportunity at a time when the brief-lived dynasty is still not consolidated for a new one to take its place. And this is what happened to the Shui. After the death of Shui Wendi, he was succeeded by his son, who would be later known as Shui Yangdi. Now, because Shui Yangdi was the last emperor of his dynasty, Chinese histories depict him in a pretty stereotypical way as the exemplary last bad emperor. In Chinese histories, the last emperor of a dynasty is always painted as a corrupt, debauched, immoral, pleasure-seeking, incompetent type of guy. And although there might be a little bit of truth to these accusations, the portrait of Emperor Shui Yangdi is a bit more complicated, and I think it would be better to say that his mistake was what I've just mentioned before. He was overconfident on the power of the imperial institution and the resources, and he pushed them too far. So, as I said, there are many continuities between the Shui and the Tang. So, first, the Shui unified the empire, the Tang continued governing the unified empire. The Shui established a new capital close to what had been the Han capital of Chang'an in that area. They called it Daxingcheng. The Tang took over the same capital and just gave it its old name, its old historically appreciated name for a capital in that region, Chang'an. Under Yangdi, the third great endeavor took place, which was the building of the Grand Canal. Now, the Grand Canal was basically, as it says, a massive canal that connected the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers. And it was a massive and costly work of engineering. In a pre-industrial time, it required unimaginable amounts of manual labor and therefore hardship for the peasants, because this was corvée labor. They had to, spend some months of the year doing this work. Now, this was extremely costly, but it was very successful, and the Grand Canal became one of the main props for imperial government after the Shui for all successive dynasties, for the Tang and for the others as well. Remember, China is a pre-industrial country until the 20th century almost, and in pre-industrial countries, transportation is hellishly slow, especially land transportation was horribly slow, and fast communications are needed to make an empire efficient. The Grand Canal allowed for river communication, so there's communications by boat. From the extreme south, from all the course of the Yangtze River is mostly, you can navigate it for most of its parts. And from there, and collecting all the riches and all the rice paid in tribute to the central government in the south, all these shipments could go up the Grand Canal, get into the Yellow River, the great river of the north, and again navigate all through the Yellow River and reach in Shui and Tang times the capital, Chang'an, but later on there was an extension made to the north for the from the Yellow River to Beijing, which would become the national capital during the later dynasties. And therefore there was a highway, a water highway that connected the center south of the empire all through water with the capital of the empire in the extreme north. Now, the Grand Canal was a great endeavor, but it implied a lot of costs, and it led to much suffering and the start of rebellions among the peasantry. So it was a success of Shui Yangdi, but it was a success that would cost him his throne, allied with another silly blunder of his, which were military campaigns in Koguryo in Korea. Now, Koguryo was a very strong kingdom in Korea and very well protected by natural elements, by mountains and marshes and so on. Shui Yangdi launched a massive campaign with a huge army, which suffered a disastrous defeat. And instead of stopping, he insisted two more times, a second campaign, a third campaign, each of them employing massive amounts of workers and soldiers, and each of them with a very high death toll and very economically weakening of the state, forcing taxation to increase. And this led to massive peasant rebellions and to the end of Shui Jiangdi and his dynasty. And that's really the cause. But anyway, after this brief history lesson, let's go back to the poem. So the Sui Palace that is mentioned here and the emperor that is being referred here is Shui Jiangdi. So he is portrayed in this poem as the archetypal, corrupt, decadent, pleasure-seeking last emperor. And the special anecdote is highlighted. Now, Yangdi conquered the south for his father. He was a general in charge of conquering the last of the southern dynasties, the Chen. But he fell in love with the culture of the south after conquering and destroying the southern capital, Yangkang. He married his empress. His wife was a woman from one of the southern dynasties of Xiao surname, so therefore of the ruling dynasty of Liang, which was the one that ruled before the Chen. And, he became enamored of the culture of the south and of the city of Yangzhou, which at this time started to develop as the major hub of commerce and pleasure, which it would continue to be all through the Tang dynasty. So much did he love the south that he dwelled in the south a lot of times. In fact, he abandoned his capital for long periods and created a sort of court over the seas, a fleet of ships that went down the Grand Canal, which he had ordered constructed, and he stayed on the waters and on Jiangzhou. And this was pretty dispendious. Imperial displacements like this cost a lot of money and hardship to all the places where the emperor passed. And this topic, this is what is being depicted in this poem. The Sui Palace that is depicted here is the floating palace at incredible expense. The flotilla of ships, including the imperial one, that navigated down the Grand Canal and that more or less settled near Yangzhou. So that's the Shui Palace, that floating, ethereal, unrealistic example of hubris and luxuriousness and waste. Criticizing this expenditure is the main topic of this poem. So it's a historical poem. You could say that's the topic. It evokes this historical episode, which was real. This wasn't invented, but which is being used to generally depict the corruption of a ruler. And remember, Chinese, I'm not sure about the background to the writing of this poem, but Chinese historical poems by scholar officials are seldom just historical excursions. They are usually meant to be implied criticism of the present through precedents in the past that pretty much match it. So probably the idea here when Li Shangyin is writing this poem is he's criticizing the excessive expenditure and luxury and abuses of the emperor and the emperor's court at the time in which this poem is being written. So as I said, I don't know when this poem was written, but some of the late Tang emperors were pretty prodigal, and at least the historical chronicles like to depict them as consuming absurdly enormous amounts of gold and jewels and treasure in silly antiques. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So first couplet. He mounted his carriage and travelled south, took no special precautions, ignoring boxes of memorials that urged him not to go. So the poem begins in medias res with the idea that the emperor, the unnamed, the only obliquely referenced emperor, is moving south. And we know from what I've just given you as background the context in which he is moving south. He is abandoning his capital for enjoying a boating trip, a long boating trip on the waters of the main rivers of China and the Grand Canal. So it says he mounted his carriage. This is just a symbol. The emperor's carriage, mounting his carriage, is a symbol for the emperor's mobility, although we know from this poem and from the context that he's not actually mounting a carriage, he's mounting a boat, really. But he travels south. And already from the first line, the recklessness of this move is emphasized. Took no special precautions, and the second line indicates us that his officials disagreed with this, ignoring boxes of memorials that urged him not to go. The place of an emperor is in his capital. He shouldn't be roaming around because, that's expensive. And that reminds one of the tours of inspection of some pretty bad emperors who liked to enjoy themselves and to also to show off and force the people to suffer those trips of the emperors, like the first emperor Qin Shi Huangdi or Han Wudi as well. So he's moving south, and he shouldn't have. And also, I didn't mention this in the introduction I made a moment before, but the South, after the period of disunion, there is this cultural divide in China between the North and the South. And in the scholar officials' mentality, especially during the Tang, this divide is explained as the South is very prosperous and rich, but it's decadent and immoral. So there's this appreciation of the superior artistic and aesthetic culture created by the southern dynasties during the period of disunion. But this culture in this world of the South is also perceived as seductive and corrupt and decadent, and a world that does not really follow the strict Confucian virtues. Opposed to it is the north of China, which was under barbarian conquest. In fact, the emperors of the Sui and the Tang dynasty had barbarian blood in their ancestry. But there's this idea that the northerners are more manly. They're more, they're poorer. They are maybe a little bit unsophisticated culturally and aesthetically, but they are manly. Like they're good warriors, ready to fight it out, purer Confucians. So there is this ambivalence. The Tang creates a common culture, but a common stereotype for scholar officials at this time is differentiating between the southern, more refined but decadent and dangerous culture, and the northern, simpler, more rudimentary but more Confucian and more martial sort of culture. So this displacement of the emperor to the south is also implicitly conveying us the idea that he is becoming weak, corrupt, and decadent. And that would be another reason why the memorials would suggest not going south. So the emperor is going. The second couplet, the first couplet actually depicts the situation. The emperor is going south, and he's doing it heedless of wise advice. Second couplet tells us what he does in the south, or at least it encapsulates his southern trips into an image, which is luxurious, lavish, but also the image of irresponsible waste. In the spring wind, the whole kingdom made brocades for the palace. Half he used for mud flaps, half for sails. So in the spring wind, the wind is pushing the sails in its spring. The whole kingdom, so that's a bit of a hyperbole, but the whole kingdom is making brocades for the palace. Why brocades? Because the palace is not a physical palace. It's this flotilla that we've talked about, this pleasure flotilla, this navy in which Shui Yangdi and his courtiers are moving over the waters. So two things need to be provided. The whole kingdom is producing enormous amounts of brocade as an extra tax. And what is it being used for, this massive brocade? Not for things that the state, the country needs, the peasants or the defense of the frontiers, but just for this showy pageant of river navigation. Because half of all these brocades that the whole kingdom is making are used for the sails of the boats, and half of them are used for mud flaps. So mud flaps, they go into the horses' clothing, to protect the rider from the mud. So all these brocades that are created by the empire at an incredible cost are being used frivolously for silly things that are not the proper ones in which brocades should be employed. For sails, where cheaper materials should probably be used for sails, and also for mud flaps, where cheap materials should be used for this. This points at the presumed extravagance and excessiveness of Shui Jiangdi. Okay, and I think that's all for today. This was a pretty long recording, but knowing the historical context, I think, really allows you to appreciate the meaning of the poem better.